Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Mystery. The desert stretches endlessly in every direction, dry, silent, and humming with mystery. Somewhere in the Nevada wilderness, past a chain of forgotten dirt roads and behind barbed wire fences, begins the strange and unsettling story of Bob Lazar. Robert Scott Lazar wasn't always a household name in UFO circles. In fact, for much of his early life, he tried to blend into the background. He was born on January 26, 1959, and raised in Coral Gables, Florida. A self-proclaimed tinkerer, Bob developed a fascination with technology at a young age. Rocket engines, electronics, lasers. If it had wires or exploded, Bob was drawn to it. By the early 1980s, Bob had moved west, eventually landing in Las Vegas. There, he claimed to work as a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, contributing to classified projects. Official records from Los Alamos are murky. Some claim he never worked there. Others insist he was on a subcontract. What's certain is this: Lazar would soon become the center of one of the most controversial claims in UFO history. It was 1989 when he went public. Appearing on Las Vegas television under the alias Dennis, his face hidden in shadow, Lazar made a startling announcement. He said he had worked on alien spacecraft at a facility known only as S4, a secret base near the infamous Area 51. According to Lazar, the U.S. government was in possession of 9 extraterrestrial craft, 9 flying saucers of unknown origin, stored in hangars carved into the mountainside of S4. His job, he claimed, was to help reverse engineer the propulsion system of one of these crafts. The propulsion system, he said, was unlike anything known to modern science. It ran on a mysterious element called Element 115, an isotope that did not exist on Earth.
This element allegedly produced gravity waves, bending space-time itself and allowing the craft to move instantaneously from one point to another. To the casual viewer, Lazar seemed calm and articulate, not a wide-eyed fantasist, but a reluctant whistleblower. He spoke with precision, describing the inner workings of the saucer, the layout of the base, the nature of his security clearance. He even described biometric hand scanners decades before such technology became widespread. Skeptics, of course, attacked his credibility. His educational records, allegedly from Caltech and MIT, were missing. There were no diplomas, no yearbook entries, no student rosters listing his name. Lazar claimed the government had erased all trace of his past to discredit him. Whether erasure or fabrication, the ambiguity only deepened the mystery. Even stranger were the details he provided about S4 itself. Located just south of Groom Lake near Papoose Lake, S4 was allegedly buried into the mountains. Each saucer was stored in its own hangar, with massive bay doors disguised to look like the surrounding rock face. Lazar claimed the craft he worked on had a metallic, almost liquid surface, seamless, cold to the touch but oddly inviting. He spoke of briefings he was required to read, documents claiming that the beings behind these saucers were from the Zeta Reticuli star system, over 39 light-years away. According to these briefings, the U.S. government had been in possession of extraterrestrial materials since the late 1940s. Some say Lazar invented the story for fame. Others believe he was part of a deliberate disinformation campaign. But one thing is clear: Lazar's appearance sparked a renewed global interest in Area 51 and fueled decades of speculation.
He spoke with a level of technical detail that was hard to dismiss, and over the years, some of the information he leaked, like the presence of a secret facility near Papoose Lake, has been quietly supported by satellite imagery and independent research. But who was Bob Lazar, really? Was he a scientist turned whistleblower? A man who sought too much and decided to tell the world? Or was he something else entirely? As we drift further into this mystery, let's follow Lazar deeper into the desert, past the checkpoints and cameras, and into the darkness of S4, where the extraordinary may just be true.
He was told to observe, not interfere. His primary task was to reverse engineer the propulsion system to understand how it worked without truly being told where it came from. But the implications were obvious. Inside the craft, everything was scaled strangely. Lazar noted that the ceilings were low, the chairs small, designed perhaps for beings of shorter stature, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. The interior was minimalist. No control panels, no wires, just smooth curved walls and a single central column that extended from floor to ceiling. That column, he was told, was the reactor. The heart of the propulsion system was the so-called gravity amplifier. Lazar claimed the craft used 3 of them, positioned in a triangle beneath the floor. These amplifiers emitted gravitational waves which could be directed and manipulated. It wasn't propulsion in the traditional sense, it was distortion. By bending the space-time fabric itself, the craft could move not by flying, but by falling into warped space ahead of it. It would essentially compress the space in front of it and expand the space behind it, allowing for instantaneous movement. There was no sound, no exhaust, just a kind of graceful, silent drift. The source of this gravity manipulation was a reactor powered by element 115. At the time, this element didn't exist on the periodic table. It hadn't been synthesized, but Lazar claimed it was stable in the form found inside the reactor, creating a small, powerful source of energy that required no cooling and emitted no radiation. Element 115, he said, was bombarded in the reactor, releasing anti-gravitational energy. That energy was then amplified and directed by waveguides to the gravity amplifiers beneath the craft. The whole system, according to Lazar, was centuries ahead of human science. He never claimed to fully understand it. His team was compartmentalized. He wasn't allowed to speak to engineers working on the craft's metallurgy or those studying its control systems. Everyone had a narrow focus. The left hand was never meant to know what the right hand was. That kind of isolation made Lazar uneasy. He described an atmosphere of paranoia. Armed guards patrolled every hallway. Conversations were monitored. Employees were warned never to discuss their work off-site. Infractions were met with immediate termination, or worse. Once Lazar claimed he was shown a live test of the craft in flight. The sport model lifted off the ground effortlessly, floated in the air, then zipped off at an angle that defied inertia. It moved like a leaf in water, fluid, unpredictable, alive. The craft made no noise, just a faint vibration in the chest, like the hum of a distant turbine. Watching it hover there, Lazar realized this wasn't technology stolen from a rival nation. This was something else, something not of this Earth. Over the course of several weeks, his understanding deepened, but so did his unease. He began to feel watched, even outside of the base. Helicopters hovering over his home, cars parked down the street with blacked-out windows. He started to worry that talking, even to his wife, might cost him his life. So he did something dangerous. He brought friends to the desert. Chapter 3. The Desert Stakeouts. Bob Lazar knew he was violating his clearance. He knew that if he was caught, the consequences could be catastrophic. But fear and curiosity are powerful forces. He had seen something beyond imagination, and he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. One night, he gathered a small group of friends, including fellow physicist Gene Huff and his wife at the time, Carol. They met outside Las Vegas, then drove out into the vast Nevada desert. Their destination? A spot overlooking Papoose Lake just south of Groom Lake Complex, a place where Lazar claimed test flights of the alien craft routinely occurred. He had chosen a Wednesday night for a reason. According to Lazar, test flights were conducted midweek, after dark, when prying eyes were few and far between. With camcorders and binoculars, they settled into position, cloaked by the night. And then they saw it. A glowing orb, bright and silent, lifted into the sky above the mountains. It hovered, motionless, then darted at impossible angles, up, then sideways, down again. The movement was unlike any conventional aircraft, smooth, fluid, and without inertia, just like Lazar had described. The group was stunned.
They filmed what they could, their shaky footage capturing only small glowing lights against the black sky. Still, for them, it was confirmation. Lazar wasn't lying. They had seen something no one was supposed to see. But the excursions didn't go unnoticed. On a subsequent trip, they were intercepted. Armed military personnel appeared from the darkness, detaining them on the spot. Their names were taken, their cameras seized, and Lazar, he was brought in for questioning. He was confronted with transcripts of his phone calls, proof that his communications were being monitored. He was warned sternly never to return. The message was clear. His involvement with S4 was over, but the surveillance didn't stop. He was followed, harassed, threatened, and in those tense days that followed, Lazar made a fateful decision. If the government intended to silence him, he would speak first, loudly, publicly, and without fear. That's when he reached out to George Knapp, an investigative journalist with Las Vegas station KLAS. Knapp had a reputation for tackling unusual stories, but nothing could prepare him for what Lazar shared. In a televised interview that would shake the world, Lazar appeared with his face obscured and voice altered. He detailed everything: S4, the craft, the gravity propulsion systems, Element 115, and the strict compartmentalization of the operation. Overnight, Area 51 became a household name. The interview exploded into public consciousness. UFO researchers hailed Lazar as a whistleblower. Skeptics dismissed him as a hoaxer. But the discussion had changed. People who had never heard of S4 or Groom Lake were now asking questions. In the months that followed, Lazar gave more interviews. Now with his identity fully revealed, he spoke calmly, rarely wavering in his details. And while some of his claims were impossible to verify, others began to gain traction. One striking example was the hand scanner Lazar described, a device used at S4 to verify personnel. At the time, it sounded far-fetched, a machine that measured bone length in the hand to confirm identity. But years later, photographs surfaced of an identical device used in military installations. A small vindication, but a compelling one. Then there was the matter of Element 115. When Lazar first mentioned it in 1989, it hadn't been discovered, but in 2003, scientists in Russia and the US synthesized a new element, muscovium, with an atomic number of 115.
It was unstable, decaying in milliseconds, but Lazar insisted the version used in the craft was a stable isotope, something we had yet to replicate. Whether coincidence or confirmation, the discovery gave Lazar's claims a strange new relevance. But despite the attention, Lazar never seemed to relish the spotlight. He retreated from the public eye, opening a small business building and selling scientific equipment. He declined most interviews, citing safety concerns and the toll the publicity had taken on his life. For decades he remained silent, but the legend of S4 grew. Researchers, truth-seekers, and filmmakers kept digging, and in the shadows of Nevada's desert, a strange quiet lingered, one that seemed a whisper of secrets buried deep beneath the mountains, and of a man who claimed to have seen beyond the veil. They met outside Las Vegas, then drove out into the vast emptiness of the Nevada test site, just miles from the edge of restricted government land. Lazar knew the flight schedule. He said test flights usually occurred on Wednesday nights under the cover of darkness, away from prying eyes. They parked on a dirt trail overlooking the Groom Lake area. Armed with telescopes, cameras, and night vision gear, they settled in, hearts pounding with anticipation. What they witnessed, Lazar claimed, confirmed everything. High above the desert floor, a glowing orb appeared. It hovered, pulsed, then darted across the sky at speeds no aircraft could match. It would stop, hover, change direction instantly, then vanish in the blink of an eye. It performed maneuvers that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Lazar turned to his friends and whispered, "That's it. That's the sport model." They watched breathless as the light returned several more times that night. It never made a sound. Over the next 2 weeks, they returned twice more. On each occasion, they witnessed the same phenomenon – silent, gravity-defying movement. But on the third visit, everything changed. Just minutes after they set up their cameras, Lazar noticed a strange glint in the distance. A vehicle. Then another. Within moments, the area was bathed in spotlights. Government security forces had found them. The group was detained and questioned. IDs were taken. Film was confiscated. Though no one was arrested, Lazar knew the message was clear. Stop watching. He had crossed a line. The next day he was called back to S4. His badge no longer worked. He was taken into a small interrogation room where officials presented transcripts of his private phone call. They had been listening. Lazar was accused of breaching national security, of endangering lives. He was told in no uncertain terms that if he spoke to anyone else, if he so much as whispered what he'd seen, there would be consequences. Frightened and angry, Lazar realized he was trapped. He had become a liability, and he feared that if he stayed quiet, he might disappear entirely. So he made a decision, a desperate one. He reached out to investigative journalist George Knapp at KSNV in Las Vegas. He told Knapp everything about S4, about the saucers, about Element 115. At first, he remained anonymous, using the alias Dennis, but soon he went public. The interview aired in May 1989, and it sent shockwaves through the world. Here was a man, calm, intelligent, credible, claiming first-hand knowledge of alien technology under government control. UFO enthusiasts erupted. Skeptics pounced, but Lazar's name was now forever etched into the lore of Area 51. In the days following the broadcast, Lazar said his life was turned upside down. He received threats. His reputation was attacked. Journalists descended on his home. Friends distanced themselves. Still, he didn't recant. He knew people would question his story. His academic credentials couldn't be verified. Records of his employment at Los Alamos National Laboratory were inconsistent, but Lazar stood firm. He insisted the truth had been buried, and he had nothing to gain by lying. Over the years, some of Lazar's claims have gained credibility. The hand scanner he described in the 80s, once mocked as fantasy, was later confirmed to exist, and in 2003, scientists synthesized Element 115, though only in unstable forms. But Lazar never returned to S4. He moved on with his life, running United Nuclear, a small scientific equipment business, and avoiding the spotlight. Yet the shadow of what he'd seen never left him, and for those who believed, he had already said enough. Enough to suggest that humanity was not alone. Enough to question what secrets lay buried in the desert. Chapter 4. The Fallout and the Doubt. When Bob Lazar stepped into the public eye in 1989, he expected disbelief. What he didn't anticipate was how thoroughly his life would be unraveled. Journalists, skeptics, and government officials began digging, eager to prove he was a fraud. They questioned everything. The first point of attack, his education. Lazar claimed to have degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the California Institute of Technology, but investigators could find no records, no transcripts, no yearbooks, no student registries. It was as if he had never attended at all. Lazar maintained that his records had been deliberately erased as part of a government effort to discredit him. He pointed to the loss of his employment records at Los Alamos National Laboratory as further evidence. Yet, a 1982 phone book from Los Alamos listed him as a technician, and a newspaper article featured him working on particle accelerators. These breadcrumbs suggested he had at the very least been employed in scientific work. Still, skeptics seized on the inconsistencies. They argue that Lazar may have worked at Los Alamos but as a low-level contractor, not a physicist, that he may have attended community college but not MIT. The narrative was slowly being chipped away. And then there was the legal trouble. In the early 1990s, Lazar was arrested for aiding and abetting a prostitution operation. The charge had nothing to do with UFOs, but it damaged his credibility. In the eyes of the public, the eccentric UFO scientist now had a criminal record. For many, it was the final nail in the coffin, but for others, it was more reason to believe. They argued that Lazar was being targeted, harassed, punished for speaking out. His run-ins with the law, they claimed, were orchestrated to undermine his character. To some, he was a truth-teller under attack. Years passed and Lazar faded from the spotlight. He settled in Michigan, then returned to Nevada, running United Nuclear, a small scientific equipment business, and avoiding the spotlight. Yet the shadow of what he'd seen never left him, and for those who believed, he had already said enough to suggest that humanity was not alone. For the believers, that calmness was proof. For the doubters, it was the rehearsed delivery of a practiced liar. In 2018, nearly 3 decades after his first interview, Lazar returned to the public eye once more. This time in the documentary Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers, directed by Jeremy Corbell. The film reignited interest in his story, introducing Lazar to a new generation of UFO enthusiasts. The documentary didn't offer new evidence, but it did show Lazar as a man deeply changed by his experiences. He appeared weary, reluctant, and intensely private. Corbell described him as the reluctant whistleblower, not a man seeking attention, but someone burdened with knowledge. In the film, Lazar detailed one of the most frightening nights of his life. He awoke to the sound of footsteps outside his house. When he looked through the window, he saw a dark vehicle parked in the street. Moments later, the power in his home went out. Whether it was paranoia or something more, he never found out. Lazar's wife, Joni, described the constant stress, the phone taps, the strange clicks, the feeling of being watched. To them, life had become a quiet form of warfare, not with bullets, but with fear. Still, Lazar insisted he had no regrets. In his words, "If I could go back, I probably wouldn't change anything. I didn't ask for this, but I won't lie about what I saw." That quote would echo across UFO forums and documentaries for years to come. By now his story had become legend, a fixture in UFO lore. For many, Lazar was the man who opened the door to the secret world of black-budget alien research. For others, he was a clever hoaxer with just enough technical know-how to make it believable. But perhaps the most interesting question isn't whether Bob Lazar was telling the truth. Perhaps the real question is, why did his story resonate so deeply for so long? Maybe it's because Lazar's tale touches on something primal, a need to know what's out there, a hope that we're not alone, and a fear that the answers are being kept from us. And in the quiet hours of the night, under the stars of the Nevada desert, that hope and fear are almost indistinguishable. Chapter 5. The Physics of the Impossible. As Bob Lazar's story settled into the public consciousness, attention turned to the science behind his claims. Was any of it even remotely possible? Could the exotic technology he described exist within the laws of physics? The centerpiece of his account was the alien reactor, a device smaller than a basketball capable of generating its own gravitational field. He said it operated without conventional fuel, producing no emissions, no heat, no sound. At the heart of it all, Element 115. Back in 1989, Element 115 had not been discovered. It was purely theoretical, residing in the so-called island of stability on the periodic table. Lazar claimed it was used to fuel the craft's gravity amplifiers, small spherical devices that bent space-time, allowing the saucer to slip between points in space. According to Lazar, the reactor created a distortion bubble, a gravitational lens that pulled the craft forward. Rather than propelling itself through the atmosphere, the ship altered the space around it. It didn't move. It fell through space. The implications were staggering. In demonstrations at S4, Lazar said he observed the craft hovering effortlessly. When powered on, it emitted a deep hum and a faint glow. He was told that only certain humans, those with particular neurological wiring, could pilot it. The interface, he claimed, was mental as much as physical. The propulsion system wasn't based on combustion or magnetism. It was gravity-based, something modern physics still considers nearly impossible to manipulate in such a way. But Lazar insisted it worked. He had seen it. In 2003, scientists in Russia finally synthesized a version of element 115, dubbed Moscow. But it was unstable, decaying in milliseconds. Skeptics pointed to this as proof that Lazar had fabricated his story. How could a stable isotope be harnessed if it couldn't even exist? Lazar countered that the synthesized version wasn't the same. He claimed the sample he worked with was an isotope not found on Earth, perhaps manufactured or perhaps native to another star system. In either case, it wasn't something humans could produce yet. Still, Lazar admitted something humbling. He didn't fully understand the technology.
Much of his work at S4 involved reverse engineering, trying to make sense of mechanisms far beyond human design. In his words, it was like giving a motorcycle to someone from the 1800s. The gravitational amplifier, he said, bent light itself, making the craft nearly invisible when activated. During one test, the saucer reportedly lifted off the ground, tilted, and accelerated instantaneously. No inertia, no resistance. The onboard systems created a gravity field that decoupled the craft from Earth's own gravity. While even more bizarre was the orientation of the craft. Lazar said it flew belly first, not nose first. The gravity amplifiers were mounted on the underside of the ship, and by focusing them forward, the craft essentially fell in the desired direction. It defied every conventional principle of aerodynamics. For physicists, this presented a paradox. If such a craft existed, it would rewrite the rules of propulsion. It would render fossil fuels, combustion engines, even rockets obsolete. And if the gravity amplifier was scalable, it could unlock interstellar travel. But gravity isn't something we manipulate casually. Despite Einstein's work on general relativity and decades of research into gravitational waves, humanity has never generated a usable gravitational field. Lazar's claims stood alone, unsupported, yet tantalizing. In interviews, Lazar explained the physics with quiet conviction. He diagrammed the amplifiers, the reactor, the waveguides. He described how the gravitational distortion bent not just space, but time, slowing it within the field. The ship, he claimed, experienced a different clock than the outside world. Skeptics accused him of technobabble, of stringing together high-concept jargon to mask the lack of evidence. But others saw a glimmer of truth. Lazar spoke like someone who had wrestled with alien technology, someone humbled, even overwhelmed by what he had seen. And while some dismissed his science, others took it as inspiration. Engineers, inventors, and fringe physicists began probing the boundaries of propulsion. Projects exploring inertial dampening, gravitational shielding, and exotic matter sprang up in labs and basements alike. Lazar, for better or worse, had planted a seed. That seed continues to grow quietly, persistently, in the minds of those who believe we've only just scratched the surface of what's possible. Chapter 6. The World Reacts. As the dust settled around Bob Lazar's explosive claims, the world began to respond. Not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate ripple. A ripple that traveled through government corridors, scientific institutions, conspiracy circles, and late-night radio shows. The first wave came from the media, Local news outlets initially covered Lazar as a curiosity, a quirky whistleblower with a wild story. But as more national attention gathered, so too did the criticism. The mainstream press painted him as either a deluded man or an opportunist. His lack of documentation didn't help. Still, there were cracks in the facade. A few journalists noted strange coincidences, people around Lazar refusing to talk, records that once existed but had seemingly disappeared, and security clearances that Lazar referenced with uncanny accuracy. These weren't just guesses. They hinted at knowledge from the inside. Then came the response from the scientific community. Physicists, astronomers, and engineers were divided. Some dismissed Lazar outright, citing the impossibility of gravity manipulation and faster-than-light travel. But a smaller group took a different stance. Not endorsement, but curiosity. What if, they wondered, the propulsion system Lazar described was unlike anything known, yet it aligned eerily with certain theoretical ideas? Wormholes, space-time curvature, gravitational lensing. These weren't fantasy. They were real parts of advanced physics, and Lazar, though not academically credentialed, seemed to speak their language. In UFO circles, however, Lazar was a prophet. Conferences began quoting his testimony. Diagrams of the S4 facility were drawn by amateur analysts. Gravity amplifier schematics were recreated in 3D models. Lazar's story had become the skeleton key to every other UFO narrative. Roswell? The crashed craft could have been one of the 9 from S4. Rendlesham Forest? Possible reverse-engineered tech in play. The Tic Tac sightings? Echoes of the propulsion Lazar described. His testimony created a framework, one that explained decades of anomalies. Even within the U.S. government, his claims couldn't be entirely ignored. In closed-door hearings, intelligence officials were asked about Lazar's story. No confirmation came, but no firm denial either. In the opaque world of black-budget programs, silence often speaks volumes. In 2017, nearly 30 years after Lazar's first interview, the New York Times published a bombshell report. The Pentagon had been funding a secret UFO research program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. Suddenly, Lazar didn't seem so far-fetched. Videos released by the Department of Defense showed Navy pilots encountering unknown craft that moved with instantaneous acceleration, defied inertia, and displayed no visible propulsion. To many, these sightings mirrored the behavior of the vehicles Lazar had described. Public interest surged. UFOs, now rebranded as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, were no longer taboo. Serious institutions began to ask serious questions. And in the background of all this renewed interest, Bob Lazar's name resurfaced. Podcasts, documentaries, Reddit threads, and YouTube channels reignited the debate. Was Lazar the original whistleblower, or just an early fabricator who got lucky with predictions? Opinions remained split. Jeremy Corbell's 2018 documentary gave Lazar a new platform and a new audience. Millennials and Gen Z viewers, many encountering his story for the first time, found it compelling. The footage of Lazar, no longer young, sitting quietly at his desk, added an unexpected gravity. He looked tired, worn, sincere. And then there were the indirect confirmations. Former military officials began speaking out. People like Luis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon, who suggested the U.S. government did in fact have materials of unknown origin. Not quite the S4 bombshell, but adjacent enough to keep the Lazar theory alive. The public's relationship with Lazar shifted over time. He went from crackpot to cult figure to something more complex, an enduring mystery. Not quite discredited, not quite proven, just lingering, like a riddle never fully solved. He didn't tour, he didn't sell merchandise, he ran a chemistry supply store. He stayed mostly offline. And when asked why he didn't cash in, Lazar would say, "I don't care if you believe me. I never did this for attention." For some, that restraint made his story all the more believable, because the truth, after all, doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be told once, and then it echoes forever. Chapter 7. Life in the Shadows.
As Bob Lazar's name receded from the headlines, his life did not return to normal. In fact, it never had the chance to. From the moment he spoke out, he had become a marked man. Not in the cinematic sense of being hunted, but in the quieter, more subtle way lives are changed forever. Lazar opened a scientific supply company, United Nuclear. It was his attempt to move on, to create a new chapter far from saucers and secrets. The store sold chemicals, lab glassware, high-voltage equipment, nothing sensational, but even this was not without complications. He found himself under scrutiny. Regulatory agencies frequently inspected his business. Packages were opened, orders were delayed. Some wondered if the standard procedure or part of a quiet campaign of disruption. Lazar never said much about it, but others noticed the pattern. In interviews, his demeanor changed. The firebrand of 1989, the man who exposed S4 with a trembling voice and wide eyes, became more measured, calmer, sometimes weary. He answered questions cautiously, as if measuring the cost of every word. When asked if he regretted coming forward, Lazar would often pause. Then he'd say it wasn't worth it. Not because he was lying, but because of what it did to his life. The harassment, the public ridicule, the damage to his reputation, the fact that some friends simply stopped calling. His family, too, felt the weight. The constant questions, the strange cars outside their home, the feeling that their phone calls weren't always private. It didn't destroy them, but it never left them either. Lazar had cracked a door open, and it would never shut again. And yet, despite all this, he never fully retracted his story. Not once. He never sought to cash in on it with television specials, book deals, or UFO conventions. His interviews remained rare and mostly reluctant.
When he spoke, it was often at the urging of others. In one particularly quiet moment during an interview, Lazar was asked if he feared for his life. He thought for a long time before answering. "Not anymore," he said. "At first, yes. But after a while, you realize you're just a small piece in a very large puzzle. They don't need to eliminate you. They just need to discredit you." A sobering thought. He described strange events with the same matter-of-fact tone he used when explaining physics. Phones clicking, computers behaving oddly, helicopters flying low overhead at night. Coincidences, maybe? Or maybe something more? He didn't speculate. He simply described. For decades, Lazar refused to step back into the UFO spotlight. Then, in 2018, Jeremy Corbell convinced him to appear in a documentary. It wasn't easy. Lazar hesitated, but eventually he agreed on one condition, that the film wouldn't sensationalize the story. It had to be quiet, personal, grounded. The film premiered to a packed audience in Los Angeles. The crowd was a mix of believers, skeptics, scientists, and conspiracy theorists. When Lazar took the stage for the Q&A, he was visibly uncomfortable. His hands trembled slightly, but he spoke, and the room fell silent. He didn't say anything new, no fresh revelations, just the same story he'd told 3 decades earlier. The same S4, the same saucers, the same impossible reactor. But something about the repetition made it powerful. He wasn't adding to the myth, just refusing to let it fade. Over time, Lazar became less a figure of controversy and more a fixture of modern UFO folklore. He wasn't just a man who claimed to have seen alien technology. He was the man who never changed his story. That consistency, rare in the world of fringe claims, became his quiet badge of honor. People traveled from across the country to visit his store, not for chemicals, but to shake his hand, to say they believed him. Some cried. Others simply stood in awe. Lazar never seemed to know what to do with the attention. He'd nod politely, say thank you, and then return to his work, measuring powders, restocking inventory, preparing shipments, a life of quiet routine. But every now and then someone would ask, "Do you still think about S4?" And Lazar, without missing a beat, would say, "Every day." That was never in doubt. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Sky. As the years turned and decades slipped by,
Bob Lazar's story took on the rhythm of myth, not because it was folklore, but because it refused to disappear. Like all enduring legends, it stayed alive not through noise, but through repetition. The same phrases, the same details, the same haunting calm in Lazar's voice. There was no need for embellishment, no evolving claims. What he had seen at S4 was burned into his memory like a scar left by fire. He couldn't forget it, and he didn't want to, because to forget would be to betray it, to bury something that was never supposed to be hidden. Strangely, the world around him began to shift. In the early 2020s, the stigma around UFOs, or UAPs, continued to erode. Military footage emerged. Former officials testified. Even NASA announced its interest in the phenomena. The silence that had once smothered the topic was breaking. Lazar watched from the sidelines. He wasn't campaigning for validation, but he couldn't help noticing how many aspects of the public discussion mirrored what he had said in 1989. Propulsion with no visible engines, objects with no heat signature, craft that defied known physics, echoes clear and undeniable. One particular moment stood out. A high-ranking intelligence official, during a closed congressional session, was asked if the United States had recovered craft not made by human hands. The answer wasn't disclosed publicly, but rumors leaked. Some said the answer was yes. Just that one word, yes. For those who had followed Lazar's story, it felt like confirmation. Indirect, but powerful. A thread of truth finally tugging loose from the tapestry of secrecy. If the government had these craft, then Lazar had told the truth, or at least part of it. The online community surrounding Lazar grew. Reddit forums, Discord servers, and YouTube documentaries dissected every sentence he'd ever spoken. New listeners were stunned at the technical precision in his interviews. He didn't speak like a hoaxer. He spoke like a man haunted by something extraordinary. And more importantly, he didn't ask for anything. No money, no power, no control, just a place to speak. That was rare. Some tried to build on Lazar's legacy. Independent researchers scoured Nevada for the entrance to S4. Satellite images were analyzed, terrain compared to Lazar's maps, but nothing definitive was found. If S4 ever existed, it had been wiped clean, or buried even deeper. Lazar himself never tried to return. When asked why, he would simply say, "I wouldn't get close, not again." The facility was protected by more than fences. There were layers of secrecy, of deterrence, physical and psychological. Despite that, he held on to pieces of that past, tiny fragments of a larger puzzle. He still remembered the layout of the hangars, the strange glow of the craft when powered up, the way the gravity amplifier bent light. These weren't just memories, they were anchors, tethers to the impossible. In his shop, amidst shelves of beers and coils, Lazar occasionally drew diagrams for curious visitors, a rough sketch of the saucer, the 3-reactor setup, the mysterious fuel, always the same, never changing, a testimony in ink. Over time, even some skeptics softened. Not all, of course, but a few began to admit that if Lazar was a hoaxer, he was a remarkably consistent one. And consistency, especially over decades, is hard to fake. It doesn't prove truth, but it does demand attention. In an era of disinformation and spectacle, Bob Lazar stood out by being quiet. He didn't yell, he didn't exaggerate, he simply told the same story over and over again, a story that somehow still had gravity. Because at its core, the Lazar story is not just about saucers or aliens, it's about secrecy, about what governments might do with knowledge beyond comprehension, about the limits of science and the courage it takes to speak out. Whether you believe him or not, the story asks a question you can't ignore. What if he's telling the truth? And that question, whispered in the quiet of night, has echoed for more than 30 years, through desert winds, through digital signals, through the thoughts of every curious soul who has looked up at the sky and wondered what's really out there. Chapter 9. The Weight of Memory. As Bob Lazar moved into the later stages of life, he didn't vanish from public view, but he never sought the spotlight either. It was as if he lived in the boundary between myth and man, still very much alive, still running his scientific supply shop, still carrying a story too strange for comfort, but also perhaps too consistent to dismiss. He lived in a modest house with his wife, surrounded by a quiet landscape, the trappings of a man who never expected or wanted fame. Inside, among the ordinary furniture and workbenches, were relics from the past, photos, papers, worn books on the physics, and notebooks with diagrams that few would recognize. Sometimes he would leaf through them, not as a man dwelling on old glories, but as a scientist trying to make sense of something still beyond comprehension. There were no headlines now, no television cameras, just quiet recollection and the occasional visitor who asked softly, "Do you still believe?" Lazar always gave the same answer. He didn't phrase it like belief, he phrased it like memory. It's not about belief, it's about what I saw. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The weight of that memory seemed to live in his posture, in the way he looked just past the horizon when thinking aloud. Over the years, friends and colleagues, those willing to speak, remarked on the consistency of Bob's character. He never crumbled under the weight of ridicule. He never lashed out at critics. He never tried to revise the story to fit new narratives. He simply remained himself. There's a quiet bravery in that, to tell a story that the world isn't ready to hear and to live with the consequences without bitterness. Lazar didn't build a movement. He didn't form a cult. He didn't ask for loyalty or money, just attention to the facts, and maybe a little patience. And still the years brought occasional surges of renewed attention, a new documentary, a classified report, a sighting by a Navy pilot. Every wave of disclosure seemed to push the story back into the world's awareness. Each time, Lazar remained steady, not excited, just resigned. There was a sadness there too, not self-pity, but a kind of scientific mourning. What he'd glimpsed at S4 wasn't just alien, it was elegant, a glimpse of a technology that could change everything, and yet it had been buried, tucked away in a dry desert hangar, hidden from the minds who might understand it. He once said, if we had even a partial grasp of how that propulsion worked, we could eliminate the energy crisis overnight. Not hyperbole, just math. Gravity manipulation, if real.
In a world driven by noise, he chose stillness. And in doing so, he became unforgettable. But the questions remained. And in the end, maybe that's what mattered most. Not the answers, not the proof, but the questions. The idea that the universe is wider, stranger, and more beautiful than we dare to admit. Bob Lazar wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a martyr. He was just a man who saw something he couldn't explain. And instead of running from it, he told the world. That's rare. That's brave. And that, whether you believe his story or not, is worth remembering. Because when you lie awake at night staring at the ceiling or the stars, when you wonder if we're alone, if the sky is hiding something, if there are machines above us moving through dimensions we barely understand, you'll think of Bob Lazar. And somewhere in the stillness between thought and dream, you might hear a whisper that says, gravity amplifiers, element Stopatnock, sport model S4. And maybe, just maybe, that whisper will stay with you, just like it stayed with him. Chapter 11. The Echoes Remain. Bob Lazar's story never truly ended. It simply faded gently into the collective subconscious of those who listened, like a half-remembered dream that lingers in the morning stillness. Whether you believed every word or simply saw it as a reflection of our yearning for the stars, his words carved a space in the conversation about who we are and what might be watching us. Years passed. Governments changed. Classified documents were leaked. Fighter pilots reported encounters with things they couldn't explain. And each time the news cycle returned to the question of extraterrestrial life, Lazar's name reemerged, not shouted, but whispered, as if to say, "He told us long ago." His legacy became something more than evidence or theory. It became folklore, not in the sense of fiction, but in the sense of persistence. A story passed quietly from one truth seeker to another, shared in dorm rooms, on late-night drives, in forums buried deep in the web. Have you heard about Bob Lazar? And the younger generations, those born long after he spoke out, found themselves captivated, not because he had answers, but because he asked the right questions. What is gravity really? Why do governments hide what they find? And if something not from this earth was ever recovered, what would it mean for everything we know? That's the thing about the Lazar story. It isn't about saucers or science. It's about perspective, about how fragile our understanding of reality might be, about how quickly the line between ordinary and impossible can be crossed with one strange invitation to a desert facility. Many who encountered Bob Lazar's tale didn't walk away convinced, but they did walk away changed. Suddenly the world felt bigger, more complex, and that sliver of doubt, what if he was right, never quite left them. That is the mark of a story with staying power. In the end, perhaps Bob Lazar wasn't just a scientist or a whistleblower or a myth. Perhaps he was a mirror, a reflection of our deepest desire to know the unknown, to pull back the curtain and glimpse what lies beyond. And even if the view is brief and the image unclear, it still tells us something vital, that we are not done exploring. Late at night, if you sit in silence and think back to his story about sport model craft and gravity amplifiers, about an element beyond the periodic table, about a hangar carved into the Nevada earth, you may not find the answers, but you may feel something else. Curiosity, wonder, a sense of scale. Maybe Lazar's role was never to prove, maybe it was to provoke, to awaken a question that can't be silenced by skepticism alone, a question that keeps you looking up even when there's nothing visible in the sky. In that way, his legacy remains airborne, suspended in the same space his story emerged from, above the mountains, beyond the lights, between the known and the unknowable, and it waits patiently for us to catch up. The desert is quiet now. The wind still moves across Groom Lake. The facility, if it ever existed, remains sealed behind fences and sand. But somewhere out there, beyond the dust and stars, something may still hover, silent, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers the man who tried to speak for it. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, let the mystery settle around you, let the silence speak, and let the story of Bob Lazar be a soft murmur in the darkness, a reminder that some truths hide not in what we know, but in what we dare to imagine.